Welcome to the BSR podcast. Today is the 2nd of July 2020. I hope I find you in good health. Thank you so much for subscribing to the BSR podcast. Your support is highly valued. Please make sure to share amongst your networks. The written BSR will continue in the usual style, and you can find it on the website www.bigsr.co.uk. We are looking to create a new website in the next few days or weeks, and we hope that we'll be able to provide you with a better product in terms of quality. By this, of course, I mean quality of presentation, because the content will remain the same content that you have always loved for the past few years. The philosophy behind the BSR, to remind those of you who have been with us and to introduce it to those who are new, is that a democracy which is healthy requires an informed society. The purpose of the BSR is to bring more accessible information to the public, to demystify political and legal jargon, and where possible, economic jargon. Although I'm a lawyer by training, the Zimbabwean crisis is so multifaceted and so complex that we have all had to learn to be economists, to be political scientists, to be a lot of things in order to understand our situation and to try and find a way out of it, which we hope will be soon. So forgive me if you are an economist, a political scientist, a psychologist, or any other professional. We might mutilate some of the concepts and things that you hold dear. It is not because we intend to do bad things. It is simply that we are trying to understand our situation and to try and find a way of resolving the challenges that we face in Zimbabwe. I have realized over the last 10 or so years that the Zimbabwean crisis can never be resolved by looking at it from one perspective, but that we need to find the combined force of all the tools that we have available. And to that end, I will be calling on many professionals from other disciplines to help us understand these things and also to contribute to the podcast whenever opportunities arise. Today I'm going to be talking about the recent closure of Zimbabwe stock market and the ban on mobile money payment systems in Zimbabwe. There are a number of questions that I will pursue. Number one, to understand what exactly happened on the 26th of June 2020. Number two, why did it happen? Number three, who did it? Who were the parties involved? And why were they involved? Who was not involved is also an important question. The final question, of course, is the implications of this measure. We are therefore essentially doing a critical analysis of the closure of the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange and the mobile money payment systems. On the 26th of June 2020, the Government of Zimbabwe shut down the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange and banned mobile money payment systems. The decree was issued by the Secretary for Information, Publicity and Broadcasting Services, Mr. Nick Mangwana. The statement sent shockwaves across the country and beyond, especially as it came from the political arm of the government rather than from the usual traditional economic sphere. For those who are unfamiliar with the Zimbabwean political system, the Ministry of Information is the Zimbabwean regime's arm for political propaganda. Its primary function is to communicate political messaging for the ZANU-PF regime. The message was very clear. This was a political measure taken by political rather than economic authorities. The closure of a popular payment system and the stock market are economic and regulatory matters that are traditionally handled by regulatory authorities, but it was clear that they had been sidelined. The apparent marginalization of the economic and regulatory authorities was the first sign of problems and dysfunctionality of the governance system. It was clear that a matter for regulatory authorities was being directed by political institutions. Those with the mandate and expertise on economic matters had involuntarily given way to political superior forces. It was clear that the regulatory authorities were not the authors of the ban. They may not even have been consulted before the decision was taken. The tone and content of the statement is a rambling character, which read like an elaborate and badly written police charge sheet, was not only the language of politicians, but it was certainly not the language of regulatory authorities. Both the Ministry of Finance and the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe were conspicuously silent for nearly 24 hours after the ban, a sign of reluctance to claim responsibility for the garrulous statement. Indeed, when the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe finally issued a press statement late on Saturday afternoon, it was very brief and lukewarm. It looked hurried and forced, both in its tone and content. It had been written out of duty without any conviction. The statement purported to confirm the previous day's ban. However, it actually watered it down by directing that individual transactions would continue. This effectively meant that mobile money services would continue uninterrupted for the general public. It was also just a press statement, not couched in any form of a legal instrument, as a regulatory authority would do concerning such a serious matter. It became more embarrassing for the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe when it emerged that its Monetary Policy Committee, the MPC, had actually held a meeting on the 26th of June 2020, the same day that Secretary Mangwana had issued the ban on mobile money services. This meant that the Monetary Policy Committee had played no part in the decision that resulted in the ban of a major national payment system. That decision had been made elsewhere. If it had been made by the Monetary Policy Committee, it is the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe which would have issued the statement. Instead, they were as surprised as everyone else. None of them came out to defend the ban, although they are characters who usually enjoy the attention of the media. So who had made the big decision? Who is in control of economic policy making ahead of bodies that have the legal mandate to do so? Have the traditional monetary authorities been sidelined, and have they given way to a more powerful force? This, at any rate, seems to be the case. Details began to emerge over the next few days, revealing the source of the decree. On 30 June 2020, Bloomberg, an international news channel, reported that the mobile money systems and the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange had been closed on the basis of a command from Zimbabwe's security chiefs. Open quote, Zimbabwe's security force leaders sidelined the national economic chiefs and forced the government to close the stock exchange and halt most of the mobile money transactions, people familiar with the situation said. Close quote. According to this report, the security chiefs in Zimbabwe, who are part of the Joint Operations Command, or JOC as it is called, were apparently dissatisfied with the approach that is being taken by the Minister of Finance, Professor Mthuli Ncube, and the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe Governor, Dr. John Mangunja. On the 1st of July 2020, the Deputy Chief Secretary responsible for communications in the Office of the President, Mr. George Charamba, who uses a pseudonym Jamwanda2 on Twitter, appeared to confirm the role of the security chiefs when he suggested on social media that there was nothing wrong with what the security service chiefs had done in intervening on the economic matter. This is what he tweeted, open quote, "You would think it's criminal or odd for security structures to advise on markets and market-related threats to national stability," close quote. This was tweeted in large capital letters. If the story that had been published by Bloomberg was not true, you would expect the president's spokesperson to have denied it. Instead, he was actually moving an argument to justify military intervention. He was saying there is nothing wrong with the military chiefs intervening in the economic sphere, apparently because they were threats to national security. This narrative brings a new dimension to the situation because it is not just a usurpation of power by political authorities from regulatory authorities, but more specifically by military authorities. The intervention means that the security chiefs have lost confidence in the economic chiefs. According to Bloomberg, the argument being put forward is that the security chiefs are growing impatient not just with the economic chiefs but also with the general administration of President Emerson Mnangagwa. Whether or not this is a correct representation of the state of affairs remains unclear. Whatever the correct position, this direct intervention in the economic sphere should not be taken lightly. As shown by the comments of the presidential spokesperson, the intervention is being justified on grounds of national security. This is an ominous sign which deserves more attention than it is getting. It could be interpreted as laying the ground for military intervention more widely. Indeed, if it is justified for the military to intervene in order to correct so-called market-related threats to national stability, as Charamba asserted, what will stop the military from intervening to correct political-related threats to national stability in the near future? After all, similar justifications were used to justify the coup that toppled former President Robert Mugabe in November 2017. There are significant telltale signs of the military becoming uncomfortable and frustrated in an environment of a runaway crisis. The country's top soldier, General Philip Valerio Sibanda, made an unusual televised appearance last week, making some very strong comments against corruption within ZANU-PF. That appearance raised some eyebrows, and for good reason. He is not someone who usually comments publicly. This week, the Minister of Defense, Mrs. Misopam Chinguri Kashiri, repeated comments pointing to a dire situation within the barracks. 2 weeks ago, the Joint Operations Command held a bizarre press conference at which it denied the existence of a rumor of a coup. People expressed surprise, and for good reason, as to why the Joint Operations Command would convene a press conference in order to deny the existence of a rumor. Instead of quashing the rumor, it actually created and generated more rumor mongering among Zimbabweans who started wondering what exactly is going on within the military. When all is said and done, those watching the Zimbabwean situation must pay greater attention to these developments. The stock market and the mobile money businesses are merely the visible casualties, but there is a bigger political plot unfolding. However, apart from the political dimensions of this saga, which are obviously quite exciting and intriguing, there are also some immediate economic ramifications which we need to look at. First of all, the directive was essentially a decree without any legal instrument backing it. While the Mnangagwa regime has made extensive use of decrees in the form of statutory instruments, especially in economic matters, it has often done so through statutory instruments or legal directives. Such a formal legal instrument was conspicuously absent in this particular situation. The decree was simply issued using a press statement. This in itself is quite an ominous sign. Secretary Mangwana tried to scramble an old statutory instrument 24 hours after the decree, but it did not provide the legal authority for what he had done the previous day. The fact of the matter is that he was not a regulatory authority and had no legal authority to issue the ban that he had issued. Even when the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe eventually confirmed the ban the next day, it was also through a press statement and not a legal directive or a statutory instrument. Rule by decree is by nature anathema to the rule of law. It is particularly harmful where the decree affects business operations and affects property rights. It doesn't paint a good picture to Zimbabwe as an investment destination. Millions of users of mobile money platforms were affected by the ban. Thousands who invest and hold property on the stock exchange were also similarly impacted by the suspension of trading on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange. It is not surprising that Zimbabwean stockbrokers were inundated by investors following the arbitrary decree. Their property is at risk. The violation of property rights and the use of arbitrary power is a blow to a country which is crying out for help and for investment. Ironically, this is a country which is claiming to be open for business, but it shuts down the major payment system which is relied upon by millions of businesses and individuals, and the stock market. The finance minister, Professor Mthuli, has been keen to talk up Zimbabwe's chances of improving on the ease of doing business index, which is run by the World Bank. However, the latest decree will significantly diminish Zimbabwe's performance. The decree is also the latest in the government's strategy to always find scapegoats for the country's economic woes. This time is the mobile money providers and the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange. It blames them for the continuous and escalating collapse of the Zimbabwe dollar, which was introduced last year and is now trading at 1:63 on the official market and nearly 1:100 on the parallel market. A few months ago, the government was blaming the Old Mutual implied rate, which tracks the movements of the dually listed Old Mutual shares. It moved to ban the fungibility of the Old Mutual shares, which meant that shares held on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange could no longer be sold on other exchanges. Still, this did not solve the problem. It was never a solution to the problem. Many of us said so at the time, but the government was keen to use Old Mutual implied rate as a scapegoat. Now the regime has shut down the market. Really, it's almost like throwing the baby together with the bathwater. The reality is that many investors have been seeking refuge in the stock market because of the depreciation of the ill-fated Zimbabwe dollar. The currency depends on trust. However, the local currency is weak and the people of Zimbabwe have lost trust in that currency. Given this scenario, people seek other instruments to maintain the value of their savings. If the foreign currency was readily available, people would simply buy foreign currency because it's a better store of value. Now, in the absence of foreign currency, people have been looking for other instruments to store the value of their savings, and they have done so by buying shares on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange. Shutting it down means their property is now locked up on the stock market, taking away the liquidity, which is an attractive feature of that market. It also prevents the free circulation of capital and scares away investors. It is a truism that capital is timid, and whenever it feels threatened, it runs away, and Zimbabwe will be seen as a vulnerable and a very threatening space for capital. Nevertheless, those who are locked out of the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange because it's been shut down will simply look for alternatives. They will look for other assets to buy as a way of storing value. The market is always creative. In the past, some banks decided to buy bricks in order to protect their savings. People always want to build houses, so bricks are a good investment and a good store of value. The government cannot ban every market because people will always find another market in which to carry out their activities. The main aim of many investors is to protect the value of their savings and to grow them. And if the government bans one market, the investors will always look for another and find another destination for their money. For mobile money services, they've become the mainstay of the informal economy, and Zimbabwe's economy has really become predominantly informal. More than 80% of transactions in the informal sector use mobile money payment system if traders aren't demanding the US dollar. Mobile money payment systems have had the advantage of extending financial inclusion, bringing in millions of people who were previously outside the formal financial system. More than 90% of the adult population is now financially included thanks to mobile money payment systems, and this is a critical enabler to economic engagement. The largest mobile money provider, EcoCash, boasts of more than 10 million customers and has a market share of more than 90%. Millions in the rural economy rely on these mobile money platforms. This is particularly the case in an environment in which there are cash shortages. Thousands of agents and merchants rely heavily on these mobile money payment systems. This means the disruption has a significant impact on local and household economies. A ban is therefore as unsustainable as it is undesirable. The government itself has relied heavily on the mobile money payment systems for its 2% tax which it charges on electronic transactions. This was introduced 2 years ago and has brought in a lot of money for the government, which means that the ban on mobile money payment system is also self-defeating on the part of government. In conclusion, the regime must understand that the problems are not solved by banning economic activities, let alone platforms of trading. Mobile money payment systems and the stock exchange are not the problems. They certainly weren't the problem 7 years ago when Zimbabwe was using the US dollar during the multi-currency environment. There were no allegations of mobile money providers creating money as they are doing now, or that trading on the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange was fueling a parallel market. So what changed? Problems started when the government took the misguided path of a pseudo-currency in 2016. At that time, the Reserve Bank of Zimbabwe introduced what they called the bond notes. There was a lot of criticism from civil society, from intellectuals, from the opposition. The Reserve Bank of Governor promised that he would resign if the bond note failed. The bond note duly failed, but Governor John Mangunjwa did not live up to his promise. He is still in office. Last year, in June 2019, the government, again, against all common sense and reason, introduced a fully fledged Zimbabwe dollar. It was underprepared, it was under-resourced. Many people warned that the Zimbabwe dollar would struggle and that it would fail. The evidence is there for all to see. At the beginning, the Zimbabwe dollar was rated 1-to-1 with the US dollar, but less than 12 months later, it is now trading at 1-to-63 on the official market and much higher on the parallel market. Interestingly, the government had earlier last week reintroduced a forex auction system, which is supposed to be a free market idea, although there are some controls. But the idea was that the market should determine the rate of the Zimbabwe dollar. But they go on a few days later to issue bans which are completely contrary to the idea of the free market. This is the kind of policy inconsistency that has plagued the Zimbabwean economic system, thanks to a government which says one thing today and says a completely different thing the next day. The truth of the matter is that Zimbabwe's problems are deep-seated. They will not go away by scapegoating. The government must look into the mirror and appreciate the source of the problem. The problem lies within. As I have said before, and as many other people have said before, Zimbabwe's problems emanate from its dysfunctional political sphere. Unless a solution is found there within the political sphere, this scattergun approach to governance will only yield more misery and more suffering to the long-suffering people of Zimbabwe. There is need for a return to the rule of law. There is need for a return to stability. There is need for a solution to the political challenges that Zimbabwe is facing. Unfortunately, at a time when the government should be trying to resolve the political impasse in the country, it is continuing a thorough and systematic assault on the country's main opposition leader, Nelson Chamisa, as well as his party, the party that he leads, the MDC Alliance. This unedifying spectacle, which is being done under the auspices of internal conflicts within the opposition, but which is clearly aided and abated by key structures of the state, is causing more harm, more damage, and more embarrassment to Zimbabwe. The use of arbitrary power, banning mobile money payment systems, banning the Zimbabwe Stock Exchange, does nothing to assist the cause of Zimbabwe's economic recovery. It is only making things worse. So this is the end of today's podcast. Thank you so much for listening. This is our second podcast. We'll be bringing you more. There is a lot in our archives, things that we have written before, which we think should be recorded, and we'll be recording them and sharing them with you over the next few weeks. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to having you again in the next few days. Thank you.